As I shared earlier, so many of us, indeed the entire nation, the entire world, was horrified by the hatred we saw in this community, by the tragedy, by marches escalating to murder last summer. But indeed, this hasn't been the only community in the United States to face tragedy grounded in racial division, indeed that hatred for one another because they look differently, because we still are not judging one another by our character, but indeed far too often by the color of our skin. One of those cities that faced a tragedy over the last few years was Dallas, Texas. And Dr. Williams will tell you his story, but I've watched the clip of Dr. Williams on CNN with Don Lemon several times, and I cry every time. Because Dr. Williams, like Susan Bro and so many others, when they woke up that morning, they didn't know that it would be a day of tragedy, that it would be a day that would change their lives forever. But each of them, in their own way, have stepped into that, have accepted the new voice they have been given, the new platform they have been given. And Dr. Williams, in his words, saying, guys, we got to do something about this. This is crazy. How are we hating one another? We can't be this as a community. We can't be this as a nation, is exactly the message I think this country needs right now. It's my pleasure to introduce from Dallas, Texas, trauma surgeon, Dr. Brian Williams.
Thank you for that warm introduction, Pierce. And that night in Dallas was the worst night of my professional career, and it's something that still lives with me today. And I realized when I saw what happened here in Charlottesville how connected we all are when it comes to race and violence and the impact that it has on each of us. And in fact, that when I saw what happened in Charlottesville, my folks live in Hampton, Virginia. My sister went to school at James Madison, so I have Virginia ties. And I recognize, even though I was halfway across the country, we are still connected to everything that is happening. And I was actually moved to write about the Confederate monuments as a result of what happened here in Charlottesville, because Dallas at the same time was going through a similar discussion about what to do with our monuments. So I'm honored that Pearson asked me to be here today. But I also have this very awesome panel, which I'm excited to have a conversation with today. I'll start here on my far right with Renaldo Pearson, organizer for Democracy Spring, engineering residence at Harvard University.
Social engineering residence.
Social
engineering residence.
Social engineer in residence, thank you for correcting me. Then Ms. Cissie Lynch. I asked her ahead of time if I can say that she's actually the granddaughter of Billy Graham. I think that's important for the audience to know who we have up here with us. And she sits on President Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board. Next we have Mr. Matt Kibbe, who is president for Free the People and has had a lot of work working with Libertarians and the Tea Party.
Correct.
And finally, Ms. Liz Hume for the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and she's a senior director for programs and strategy. So I said I'd give each person a minute to give some more about their origin story to give the audience some context of who we're dealing with up here. So I'll start with you, Renaldo.
Sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Renaldo Pearson, as he just said. Actually just got elected, nominated and elected to be the interim mission director for Democracy Spring. I was born and raised in D.C., the metropolitan area of D.C. We moved to Prince George's County around 3rd grade in Maryland. I went on to Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, the alma mater of Dr. Martin Luther King and Julian Bond and other freedom fighters. From there, I became a criminal justice advocate, working to fight mass incarceration, end mass incarceration, served on the End Mass Incarceration Coalition that pushed the Obama administration to do all in its power to push criminal justice reform and end mass incarceration. And that wasn't until I started to see that no matter how many gains and victories we won on that front, we would continue to face diminishing returns until we fixed democracy first. I saw issues with voter suppression and the corrupting influence of big money in politics, so that led me to join Democracy Spring. Democracy Spring, we organized the largest act of American civil disobedience this century back in April 2016, marching from Philadelphia to DC, and then over 1,300 of us. I actually see some folks there who actually were part of that, were amongst the first to get arrested
using
there.
Using up time, my friend.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So
y'all can talk later after the show, but not right now.
I just saw it. I'm sorry. That's crazy. But so that's that. Democracy Swing. That's my work there, and I'm happy to be here to have these important conversations.
Thank you.
It's quite the act to follow. I am Cissie Lynch. As you introduced me, I'm in no shape or form representing the president here or the White House. I'm here because I had concerns, and I was talking to Pearson earlier this year, is my heart as I see division in this country. Especially after 2016, we saw division everywhere. We just saw division in the churches, we saw division in coworkers, we saw division in our families at Thanksgiving dinner, whatever it was. And my heart breaks over that because I didn't grow up like that. I didn't grow up, I had friends from all sides of the aisle. My mom had friends that you wouldn't expect to have as a conservative Christian, and the same was for my dad. And a story that maybe I'll get the chance to tell later is I have a very unique story with a professor who looked down at me of who I was as a conservative, but over time, her and I have the sweetest relationship of love. And we come from two different sides of the aisle, and we love and adore each other now. So as I was talking to Pearson, as I work for Samaritan's Purse and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, but more importantly as a mom, I'm sad to see the division in this country and the roots that are still there of the problem, and that is my heart, is to kind of help that division and telling my story.
Thank you. Mr. Kibbe.
So I've been a strange libertarian kid since I was 13 years old, and I read a book by a woman named Ayn Rand, and she turned me on to Austrian economics, and among other things, I learned that reading those kind of books when you're a teenager is a really horrible way to meet girls, so it's permanently damaged me in all sorts of ways. But I went to DC because I aspired to be an academic, and I got involved in public policy as an economist, and DC is sort of this Death Star that sucks you in and eats your soul, and I became a community organizer. I went from writing op-eds in the Wall Street Journal to realizing that the real power, if you want to fix Washington, if you want to fix the problems we see in our world, comes from organizing people and asking them to show up. And on this thing, we probably agree 1,000%. And in that sense, I'm a radical Democrat. I think democratizing everything, as we're seeing today with technology, is not only the problem, but it's the solution.
Can we quote him on that?
And we may argue about what we want politics to do, but more power to more people is the way we move forward. And I'm a political refugee of Republican politics, and I helped on a Rand Paul super PAC when he ran for president. I've at least temporarily left the Republican Party, and I started a Gary Johnson super PAC. So I'm a little political homeless right now, but I'm optimistic about the potential of we the people to solve these problems outside of the political structure.
Thank you. Ms. Hume.
So I work for the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and I am here in that capacity. And we're a member-based organization of over 100 organizations that work mostly internationally on violent extremism, conflict, peace building. And a couple of years ago, my CEO and I sat down and said, it's a little hypocrisy that we are working all over the world and our members are working all over the world, and we turn around in our own backyard and we are seeing the same conflict indicators and the breakdown of resiliency in our institutions, the triggers, key actors getting involved, that we're seeing all over the world. America is not exceptional in this fact. And in fact, I was talking with the city council member we have a long-standing grievances in this country: economic inequality, racial inequality, the Me Too movement. These grievances are really starting to come to the forefront. And with me sitting up here, I'm kind of the warning to you that if we're starting, conflict experts like myself are starting to look at the US and saying, we are falling down on index. The Institute for Economics and Peace has us at about 114 out of 163 countries. We sit on the Global Peace Index between Rwanda and El Salvador. That should scare us. The trust in our institutions, our public trust is falling. But I also come here with, we have a lot of solutions. We've been working all over the world. Peacebuilding programs, there is a lot of work to do. This is one example of it, contact theory. Right. But it's one part of it. And there's a lot of solutions out there. So that's sort of, I'm the warning, but also there's a lot we can do about it.
Thank you. That's a lot more. There's a lot here to unpack now. I had some different questions, but now we're going to go a little bit of a different direction. So going back to Charlottesville and the protests that happened and the deaths, that whole tragedy. So that grew out of this groundswell of negativity surrounding removing Confederate monuments across the country, right? That was just kind of going around the country. It was happening in Dallas as well. So what do you think? A lot of it has to do with the context that we look at these monuments. So just to the panel, how do you feel about what we're teaching our children in school about the legacy of racism and the Confederacy and genocide, and how that impacts how we look at the decision to remove monuments around the country? And anybody want to take that first?
I'll go. Well, in conflict theory, the monument removal was a symptom of a larger problem. And I think you go right to it in terms of education. Our schools are not really desegregated, even though they are, but they're not. Our education system it talks about slavery, but as like an institution, but not as what really happened and the economic impact that that's had on people and the justice system. We treat it as a time and place and that it's over. And I'm seeing that change a lot, but I almost feel like our education system has to be redone.
Any suggestions? Anybody else want to?
So I think and I think we agree on this, the fight over the monuments was really a proxy for a much bigger fight about identitarian politics, and there was, at least amongst the white supremacists, they viewed it as something to exploit, to try to draw in innocent bystanders that didn't really know what their agenda was. And I've talked to people, former Tea Partiers, that actually fell for it until they dug a little bit deeper. But in terms of education, I think we can say across the political spectrum, our children don't know the history of not just slavery, but authoritarian tragedies and genocides across the world. One of the things that we've done at Free the People is tried to make a very easy to consume set of video tutorials about various I call them deadly isms. And one of those is nationalism. Mm-hmm. But there's also communism and racism in South Africa and all sorts of things that I'm afraid that young people don't know these stories, and we need to tell them.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of nuance to it too, right? It's not just a binary, it's good or bad. Because
Right.
my daughter's options for elementary school were Stonewall Jackson Elementary, Robert E. Lee, which are very good schools. And I wanted her to get a good education, but I thought, what does it mean for her to be going there? She's not really learning what that means, what those names mean to her in her education. So
and that they're glorified.
Yeah, it's conflicting you want something the best for your kids, but you want them to know the truth.
And I think our destiny for this country is going to be how great we know our history.
Right.
We don't repeat it. You know, the history won't repeat itself. And I think these monuments can also be a great time to share with our children. I'm a mom as well. And this is a little bit of a different story, but I took my 4-year-old, she's 4, to see The Greatest Showman. And there's a biracial couple in the movie. She's 4 years old and caught on like, Mom, why are they sad or whatever? Great, and I had to tell her what history of like people looked down upon that and why, but we don't allow that because God created us equal, right? And she, she started saying at 4 years old, and she started singing, we're all precious in his sight. And I said, yes, sweetheart, we are. But it was that she saw that in a movie, and it was a great time to teach her. And I think, like I said, it is our destiny for this country is how great we'll know our history.
I saw the movie. I went to the movie under duress because my wife and daughter wanted to see it. And
you know the soundtrack now, don't you?
Right. I mean, it was a really good soundtrack. I was really entertained by the movie, but it left out how much of a racist P.C. Barnum really was and how he exploited
and I don't know any of
black performers for his show. And that was left out of the story. So as a black man, I left like, man, that was a really good movie. But I shouldn't like this movie, right? Because it didn't really tell the full history.
I don't think a lot of it was historical based. None of it was really historical based.
Exactly. Yeah, you're right. It's not a history lesson.
For me, for that moment, I was able to teach my little girl that we would never accept that, the world shouldn't accept that, and what it was back then.
And its importance of how entertainment
so I just get to use it as a moment to teach her.
Agree.
I think what we all agree on is that we've got to do a better job of sharing a complete history of this nation, of this world. A great quote comes to mind from Dr. John Henrik Clarke, who is a great historian. He said, history is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. History tells the people where they've been, what they have been, where they are, and what they are. Most importantly, history tells the people where they still must go and what they still must be. The relationship of history to people is the same as the relationship of a mother to her child. Right.
So, Chrissy, I want to hear the story you were about to tell. You were alluding to your story with your professor.
I first went to Liberty University. Might have heard of it, down the road. A little conservative. And
she's funny, right?
I went to...
This is my panel. I tell the jokes.
But I fell in love with a very handsome, good-looking football player from Appalachian State, and decided I was going to transfer, and I went into this classroom. And I grew up in public school my whole life, so when I went to Liberty and they're opening up in prayer, that was weird at first, different. And then I go to App State, and I have this professor, and she looked down at me and goes, Miss Liberty, right? She hated Jerry Falwell. She was from the Virginia Commonwealth. And as a Graham, I have been used to be persecuted my whole life. I've had a target on my back since I was a little girl, been mocked in school, everything. So I have tough skin. I'm okay with it. As time went on, she found out who I was. But she was a professor who opened up the conversations to all in her class, which we don't see on campuses these days. An opposing opinion is not valued, and it's not welcomed in many of our classrooms. And for me, it was great. I heard parts of arguments that were good for me to hear, because it made me challenge, what do I believe and why do I believe it? I might disagree, but there was respect. And throughout time, I gained respect in her classroom. And I think you have to earn somebody's trust and respect to gain the power of influence. And we're taking that away today. That if you disagree with them, you start calling them names and all this stuff, and it's just hate that we see. But I just went back to her class, and I got to speak in her classroom, and people got to see that her and I love each other. Now, her and I are on two different sides of the political aisle, right? She wouldn't have agreed on anything I did in 2016. But when I prayed at the National Day, or the National Prayer Service, she told me she was proud of me and still loved me. She loved me. And we love each other despite of it. And her students came up in that class, and she goes, a bunch of liberal girls came up to me and said, I don't agree with you socially, politically, religion, or anything, but I'm so thankful you came here today because you set the example of the woman I want to be and the relationships I want to have with others. And that it comes by we have to set the example.
You can have a difference of opinion.
And still love each other.
But not have difference, it doesn't mean you have difference in principle, right? So that's a good story. Thank you for sharing that one. Liz, you talked about conflict resolution, and so we're listening first, we're having discussions today. It's great. It is not a novel concept. But what can we do going forward to have real, sustainable, effective change based on some of the things that you've been doing around the world, particularly when it comes to race relations?
Well, a lot of it is context specific. So it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all that works for the United States. We are so diverse, and you'd have to go down in the local communities to do it. So that's the first thing to say. On racial inequality, you talk about the history. It's our history, but we've never reconciled with it. It's the ultimate sin of our country. So a lot of, you have to look at it through a systems lens, and that's what we talk about in the Alliance for Peacebuilding. You can't, deal with the symptom. You have to go to the cause, but you have to look at it through a systems lens. Do you target the education system? Do you target the inequality? We were talking about inequality of housing, not being able to find a place to live in your community. Is it the contact theory? Contact theory like this is very important, but you also have to get down into, what is that root cause of conflict in that community? And like I said, it'll be different every place.
Right.
New England does not look the same as Mississippi, for example.
Right.
So I think that's it's hard, it's not easy, but what we've learned is, peace just doesn't happen. You have to work and build on it. And it's not going to happen today or tomorrow or next week, but.
It's interesting, you talked about the systems. We went on a tour. Did you go on a tour to Monticello? So
yeah.
We got to go tour Monticello. It was my first time there, and I was just thinking about the dichotomy of Thomas Jefferson, who was this revered individual in our history, who also had enslaved people, but reportedly he was conflicted about that. So here he is on one side, but he's benefiting from a system that exploits humans. So it's kind of evolved today. There's still this system that's in place that people benefit from, but it doesn't make them bad people, but the system is still there, so you have to attack that system itself. And how do you do that? So education for one.
But prime example,
Right.
I went home and told my family, I was so impressed with our guide yesterday, because just a few years ago, we were at Monticello. I was there with my family, and my daughter raised her hand to ask about slavery, and somebody in the crowd, somebody started saying, well, this was their home, and they were fed, and and we walked out of there horrified. Now, fast forward a couple of years later, and the narrative at Monticello is completely different. They talked to us about slavery. These people were enslaved.
Right.
Just saying that is huge.
You had a comment on that, Renaldo?
No, I was actually impressed by the new narrative that's coming out of Monticello, because for far too long we've been taking tours of slave plantations that come from a place of the oppressor, the oppressor's narrative, and not from a place of the oppressed. So you have the Whitney plantation on the outskirts of New Orleans, Louisiana, kind of revolutionizing that space and making sure they tell the complete story from the oppressor's point of view, the oppressed point of view. And to see that coming out of Monticello yesterday, I was pleasantly surprised. But I agree, I resonate with what Brian said about the dichotomy, because I still had these parts of me that admired the brilliance of Thomas Jefferson, right? He had a copy of each letter, had the technology on his desk. I forgot what that machine was called. 19,000 letters. Had the largest personal private library of 6,000 books.
Spoke 6 languages or something
Spoke
like that.
6 or 7 languages. Invented several things in his house. Clearly a Renaissance man, right? But
Enslaved
African descendants, and also had relations with some of those enslaved Africans. So, you know, and I love that quote that he gave about, you know, it's as if we have, and that kind of like explains where he was and kind of explains, one could say, where America is today. He said, you know, it's as if we have the wolf by the ear. Justice on the one hand, and self-preservation on the other.
Right.
So you guys will be shocked to know that the Tea Party guy on the panel is a huge fan of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and I think about it in the context of where we are, and I think about it in the context of this idea of America that we continue to pursue up until this day. On one hand, Thomas Jefferson was a radical Democrat. He was a romantic about the power of the people to resolve these problems over time, and both he and Madison were radicals in the sense that they didn't want a king or a potentate or someone to dictate how we live our lives from the top down. And I think that, for its time, was a radical step forward. I happened to be born 3 days after Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, so I feel like, by accident of history, I lucked into being at the start of a new historical benchmark for how we viewed each other as human beings. And today, here we are still trying to resolve some of these problems, and I don't think we're ever going to solve all the problems. And I think we're going to have to work through them together. But I happen to be a romantic about technology, very much in the Jeffersonian sense, in the sense of radical democratization of society, that we can work this stuff out. But we're going to have to do it upstream of politics. Politics is all about creating an enemy and beating them. But society and people and communities and all this stuff we do from the bottom up, this is where the good stuff comes from. And which is why I'm here, and it's why I think this conversation is so powerful. But let's not give up on the ideal type, because we're all flawed, and certainly Madison and Jefferson were flawed in this sense. But I think there's still power in that idea of government by the people instead of government by our overlords.
Right. So we can debate which is more divisive in our country. Is it the political divide or the racial divide? Clearly race it's a huge issue, but I want to direct a question to Chrissy and Matt, because this kind of crosses both politics, race, but also religion. Because now it seems that the term evangelical has become racialized. You can't just always, white evangelicals this, white evangelicals that, as opposed to just being evangelical Christians. So I'd like to get your thoughts on what that means to you, that term that is kind of narrowed down to that specific demographic, the fact that a large number of them support Donald Trump. Not to talk about Donald Trump, but that group is who supports Donald Trump. What are your thoughts on that, from a political aspect as well as the racialized aspect of it? And you guys can flip a coin. Who goes first?
Well, I'm happy to start, but I'd love.
I have a feeling it was directed towards me.
Yeah.
No, you go ahead.
I think.
I can't see. He's at an angle here. I'm not looking at you, Chrissy. But
I'm going to give a short answer because I'm going to stick this back to you. But I think it's a mistake to create this category called evangelicals as if they're one-issue voters that only care about one thing. They're people of faith that have all of the diverse opinions that everyone in this crowd would have, including myself. And I think it's a mistake to treat them as a voting bloc, although certainly both political parties do.
I think for male evangelicals, obviously I'm not a male, white evangelical, it came down to, I don't have to vote for somebody because of their color or not their color, or their gender, not their gender. It came down to policy for a lot of evangelicals. And not to get into this because this isn't a debate and a political debate of why I believe that many evangelicals jumped up and voted for Trump. And we have our personal reasons, and I don't want to go into a debate, so I'm trying to figure out how to tiptoe around this. But I think, once again, we were categorized. You know, we had names thrown at us because we voted for it. And I was very specific when I wrote a post that went viral of why I had to choose Trump. It was very obviously we had flawed candidates to choose from.
Right.
One of them was going to be it, and I had to write as a mother and as a perspective, this is why I went down this avenue, and this is why I did it. But then we're marginalized and we're mocked and we're called names and stuff like that, and but it's like he said, it wasn't a one-issue vote for many of us. And I don't know if that answers your question, and without trying to get...
Yeah, maybe I don't know if I skirted the rules of what we can talk about, but Pierce hasn't pulled me off the stage yet, so we'll keep going. But I guess that just illustrates how maybe insulting and offensive it can be when you are treated as a monolithic group, whether that's by race,
When you were I'm sorry, I didn't
as
hear.
this monolithic group. Like if you all think the same and act the same, whether it's by race or religion or ethnicity, political ideology. When you're a group like that, you like as you said, there are diverse opinions, reasons for doing things, and when you get grouped like that, it can be insulting and offensive. But you have something to say, Liz?
I always do. As you probably already figured out, I am a Democrat. I sit on my Democratic committee in my town. But to pull that aside, one thing we have to recognize, and I'm just going to pull it back into the conflict area. Conflict doesn't happen quickly. It happens slowly. And people support these leaders. And so we have, whether we had flawed candidates, but people were supporting these candidates. And I think that's leadership. Leaders can't take us down a path that we don't let them take us down a path. And we need to be active bystanders to stand up and say, no, this is not leadership. I will not accept this. This is not who I am. These are not my values. And that's our place in this. I mean, that's looking at it from a conflict lens, but also as somebody who lives in the United States, which I will say, as we've all seen here today, and you're trying to wrestle with it, and I see it, it is so hard to be part of the conflict,
right,
and to be part of this, because we're all trying to figure it out as we go. It's easy for me to work in Afghanistan and be like, oh, these are the grievances, this is, I mean, we are figuring this out as we go. And
right,
it's really hard to be part of the conflict and try to understand how do we fix it.
And I think the conflict comes down to no Republican, no Democrat is going to fix this country. It comes down to the heart of an individual. And it's a heart issue of what's going on. It's a heart issue when it's hate. It's a heart issue when it's bigotry. And it cannot be allowed, and there's no excuse for any of it. I live in Lee County in Fort Myers, Fort Myers, Florida. And the biggest race issue there is black versus the Haitians. And the blacks look down at the Haitians as dirty. So it's a heart issue. And that's not going to go away. We have to deal with that, especially in our younger generation. What kind of music are they listening to? It's horrible. You want to talk, they're talking about doing nasty things to women in their music. They're talking dirty language and all this stuff. You go to their video games, and they can go into a video game and go into a hospital, shoot each other up, shoot all the patients, and rape one another. So
let's go back to
think,
the part about the
but I'm
heart
talking about
issue.
this is a heart issue of
Right,
what's going on, and it's a moral issue. And like I said, no Republican and no Democrat is going to fix our system. And
right,
I think healing is going to be a choice in this country, and it's going to be a choice that starts in the individual hearts of everybody here. Whether you go home and you start in your own sphere of what their influence they're talking about, you go to the college campus that you're working at or whatever, and it starts with the heart.
I'm going to push back a little bit on that because I agree there's individual heart issues, but that brings us back to the larger issue that there are systems that are still have barriers to achieving social equity. And those the systems are implicit. They're not designed to hold people back, but they exist, and the implicit bias that exists within these systems are still leading to this divide across race and ethnicity and economics. when you look at the implicit bias in individuals, your implicit bias may be incongruent with what your conscious beliefs are. So you may see yourself as not a racist or not looking down on poor people, but your implicit bias may be there, and that can influence your behavior. So even though in your heart you may feel like you're a good person, that still requires some action to attack the systems that are still holding people back. But I want to bring it back to Charlottesville because we're kind of outsiders, right? I came from Dallas, we came from across the country, so I can imagine if you're from Charlottesville sitting there thinking, look, what are you doing coming into my hometown telling me what to do? So I think I told my story about the tragedy that Dallas suffered, very similar to what you're going on here. So I want to give everyone one last opportunity to say, hey, what is your message to Charlottesville about why you came here and what you hope to leave them with? And you each have 30 seconds. Don't blame me. Pierce is back there pointing at me, okay?
Well, we may be outsiders in a sense, and the folks who came to Charlottesville last year were outsiders, but Dr. King, in his letter from Birmingham jail, was quite clear in saying that we're all caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So I'm here today because he said something 50 years ago that sticks with me today. He said, we are all, either we will learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools. And that could not be more true today, given the tipping point we're at with regard to climate change and nuclear proliferation and everything else. So the time to talk is now. I believe that conversations are the seeds from which action grows. So that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Chrissy?
You brought up MLK. He and my grandfather were very dear friends. And together, I believe they made a difference in the 50s. And I gave you a little 15-minute documentary Taken Down the Ropes. And it was my grandfather saying, no, I will not speak in the South if they're going to have segregation. And he himself went down and took down the ropes.
I read about
His
that.
head usher quit. Dr. King came and prayed at many of his crusades, and my grandfather even paid many times to get him out of prison. So, but they came from two different angles. Dr. King told my grandfather, you stay behind the pulpit and let me do the streets peacefully. And both of them came at peace and made change together. But both of them knew that it was a heart issue. And I believe there's only one person that can change the heart of a soul, and that's Jesus Christ, that can make a difference and heal it.
Thank you. Matt?
So I happen to think that there's this opportunity to find common values and shared ideas and even potentially public policy issues where we can sort of bridge that partisan divide. One of them happens to be mass incarceration, I feel very strongly about, where there is a clear racial disparity in outcomes.
I love this guy.
and we should talk about this. And the reason I
No
speak
love
it.
for me?
Oh.
No, I'm kidding.
We already loved each other.
All right, let's keep going. Let's keep going around the horn, please.
But the reason I'm here is I'm in a tiny little way trying to lead by example. I think the two sides that politics tells us that we have to choose one or the other, it's all BS, and maybe by talking a little bit, we could start that process.
Amen.
Thank you.
So you talked about the fact that you are a scholar and really love Jefferson and Madison. I too think that they were revolutionary, incredibly people, and they set up our system of democracy that, if you see, is fighting back. The resiliency in our system is there. The Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, the Parkland students. What a bunch of incredible kids, right? And the Generation Z that my children are in, that are in high school now, have only known an African-American president up until a year and a half ago, that gay marriage was a right. And so we have this incredible generation coming up, and I believe our systems are fighting back, and that's my hope for this country.
I agree, the children of the future. Thank you all very much. I enjoyed this. I learned a lot, and I plan to keep in touch with all of you after we're done here, whether you like it or not.